There's something that happens after midnight. A moment when the night stops, feeling empty, and starts feeling alive, as if unseen eyes are fixed on you from the shadows. The air grows heavier. Every sound, every creak of the floor, every whisper of the wind feels closer than it should be. They say these hours belong to the things that shouldn't exist, yet somehow do. But tonight, you're going to hear 10 true stories. Not legends, not campfire tales. These are the real horrors that tore through quiet homes, lonely streets, and unsuspecting lives after the world was supposed to be asleep. And once you know them, once you've stepped into the darkness where these people once stood, you'll never feel truly safe alone at night again. So, are you ready to listen? Because once we begin, there's no going back. Story 1. The Midnight Intruder. Clara Morton had always loved solitude. After years of cramped apartments, noisy neighbors, and city nights filled with the blare of sirens, she had saved enough to rent a small one-story home at the quiet end of Marrowline, a tree-lined street where even the air felt softer. The house wasn't much to look at. Just pale siding and an old porch swing that swayed lazily in the wind, but to Clara it felt perfect. She could see only 2 other houses from her porch, both dark more often than not. Her first few weeks there passed in peace. She grew used to the nightly creak of the oak outside her window and the distant hum of crickets. But on the 23rd night, something shifted. She had just turned out her bedside lamp when she heard it so faint she thought she imagined it a sound like the scratching of dry twigs against glass. She held her breath. The clock beside her glowed 12:04 a.m. That hour always felt heavier somehow, but tonight the air seemed thicker, almost aware. The scratching came again. This time, drawn out, slow, deliberate, not quite like a branch swaying, more intentional. Clara's mind ran through explanations. Maybe a squirrel, maybe an insect caught in the screen, but something, deep inside her, the instinct you can't rationalize, whispered no. This is different. She pushed back her blanket, her bare feet brushing the cool wood floor. The room was dim, washed only in moonlight and the yellow halo of a distant street lamp pooling through the curtain's thin fabric. She took 3 cautious steps toward the sound. It stopped. Clara's fingers hovered over the curtain. Her heart thudded hard enough that she could feel it in her fingertips. Slowly, she eased the fabric aside. There, inches away from her, was a face, if you could call it that. The skin was a white, so pale it almost shimmered, stretched too thin over bones that seemed sharper than they should be. The eyes, black and slick, reflected the faint light like dull glass marbles, but there was something alive in them, something appraising her. The thing didn't move, didn't blink. Its lips were nearly colorless, shaped in a faint curve, just shy of a smile, but there was no warmth in it at all. They stared at each other for what felt like an impossible length of time. Clara wanted to scream, or run, or even grab her phone, but her body wouldn't listen. She had the horrible sensation it was holding her there. Then, slowly, without a sound, the thing tilted its head, once, twice, like it was studying her response. Clara's breath left her in a shudder. The tapping resumed, fingertip against the glass, paced like a clock ticking down to something she didn't want to imagine. And then, without so much as a shadow shifting, it was gone. The window was empty. She stumbled back, her knees hitting the bed frame. The sound was gone, but the silence that replaced it was not relief, was charged, as though the house itself had gone still to listen. Clara sat there until the clock read 12:23 a.m., convincing herself it had been a hallucination. It wasn't. At 1:47 a.m., the sound returned. But this time, not at the window. Footsteps. They were slow, measured, and deliberate. They crunched over the gravel of her driveway, before thudding softly onto the porch steps. The sound moved along the boards 4 paces, pause, then 4 again toward her front door. Clara's mouth went dry. She reached for her phone, but even the small click of unlocking the screen seemed far too loud. She didn't dare call. The idea of speaking felt like it might alert whatever was out there. Instead, she listened. The footsteps left the porch, another crunch on gravel, and moved along the side of the house. The soft slide of something against the siding made her stomach knot. Then, nothing. For almost 3 minutes, silence. And then, to taps right beneath her bedroom window. It went on like that for the rest of the night. Passing footsteps, long pauses, scratching, tapping. Each time she thought it moved away, the sounds came back, sometimes closer, sometimes from another wall. She locked herself in the bathroom by 3:15 a.m., curling on the floor in the corner. She could hear faint creaks above her though. The house had no attic. By the time dawn crept up, the sounds had vanished. Clara unlatched the door at 6:42 a.m., exactly, and moved mechanically through her house. Checking doors and windows, everything was locked. The curtains hung still against the glass. Outside, the yard was undisturbed and no footprints, no disturbed grass, no sign of anyone. The police officer who responded was polite but dismissive. "Could have been a raccoon, ma'am," he suggested. The mind plays tricks at night. But Clara knew. The thing on the other side of that glass was no animal. She broke the lease and moved within a week. But sometimes, even in her new apartment, after she turns out the light, there's a sound. Faint, familiar. A slow, deliberate tapping on the glass. And every time, she swears it pauses right when she starts to listen. Story 2. The Vanishing Hitchhiker. It was a night wrapped in thick fog. The kind of oppressive mist that swallows light whole and turns familiar roads into shadowed highways of uncertainty. Mark had been driving for hours, the hum of his engine, and the glow of his dashboard, the only constants on the empty stretch of road ahead. Just past midnight, the kind of hour when even the toughest minds start to feel the weight of solitude. His headlights caught something moving along the roadside. There, standing in the gray blur of fog, was a young woman, dressed in a long, flowing, white gown that seemed to ripple despite the dead stillness of the air. Her thumb was extended, an old-fashioned call for a ride, but more than that. Her figure seemed almost unreal, as if she was stitched from the fabric of the night itself, and somehow half-stepped out of another world. Mark slowed his car, heart suddenly pounding, a mix of caution and a strange compulsion pulling him in. He didn't know why he felt so drawn to stop. When she slid silently into the passenger seat, the cold hit him first. Her skin was icy, colder than anything he'd ever felt, like she'd just risen from beneath the earth. Mark's voice caught in his throat when he tried to speak, and she didn't reply. Her gaze was fixed forward, eyes empty yet piercing, as if observing something invisible just beyond the fogged windshield. The car filled with a heavy stillness, the kind that presses into your chest and makes breathing a conscious effort. As they drove farther down the deserted road, an unnatural chill settled over the vehicle, wrapping Mark in numbness. The girl finally spoke, her voice a whisper so faint he almost thought he imagined it. She gave him a quiet address, one so remote, so abandoned, it was almost impossible to believe people still lived there. When they arrived at the edge of a crumbling farmhouse, surrounded by dead trees twisting into the sky, the woman turned to him, her eyes glistening with sorrow and relief. Before he could say a word, she was gone. Just like that, slipping away, into the thick fog like smoke, dissolving into the night. Mark's hands trembled as he looked around, heart hammering in his ears. The passenger seat was empty and icy cold. Yet the heaviness she left behind lingered like a shadow wrapped tightly around him, driven by equal parts dread and curiosity. Mark began to dig into local records and whispered tales. He uncovered a story that sent chills crawling up his spine. Years ago, a young woman matching her description had died suddenly on that very stretch of road, a car wreck too horrific to forget. But strange in that her body vanished without a trace. No one could explain the disappearance, and over time, the villagers spoke of a restless spirit wandering the roadside, seeking a ride home, forever trapped between the living world and the realm of the dead. Mark returned, night after night, drawn by a mixture of obsession and a need to understand. He watched the road, stretched dark and endless, waiting for the apparition to appear again. One night, as the clock edged past 3:33 a.m., the witching hour when walls between worlds grow thin, he felt a cold breath near his ear and heard a soft whisper from the back seat. "Thank you," the voice breathed, trembling with a mix of gratitude and sorrow. He spun around, heart pounding wildly, but there was no one. Just thick shadows and the fading echoes of a soul finally finding peace. Yet, the mystery lingered like a weight on his chest. The Vanishing Hitchhiker was more than a ghost story. She was a reminder that some spirits refuse to rest until someone listens, until their stories are remembered. And so long as dark roads vanish into the night, she rides, still waiting, watching, seeking the kindness of a stranger willing to give her a ride home. Story 3. The Echoes. In the Abandoned Asylum, there is a place almost forgotten by time, a sprawling, crumbling asylum, sitting on the outskirts of a once thriving town, now swallowed by overgrown weeds and silence. Its towering windows stare blankly at the sky, broken and dark, like hollow eyes watching from some long-lost nightmare. For decades, whispers have haunted these ruins, stories of anguished screams, tortured spirits, and something darker lurking. Beneath its decayed walls, Ethan, a young urban explorer with a passion for uncovering forgotten places, had heard the stories, but dismissed them as local superstition. Armed with his camera and an insatiable curiosity, he decided one chilly autumn night to venture inside before the asylum was lost forever. As he stepped through the rusted gates, under a blood-red moon, a sudden drop in temperature wrapped around him like icy fingers. The air smelled of mildew, old medicine, and decay, an oppressive heaviness that pressed on his chest. The floorboards groaned under his weight as he navigated narrow corridors lined with peeling paint and twisted, rusted vents. His flashlight beam cut through thick darkness, catching glimpses of old patient records strewn on the ground, yellowed with age. The deeper he went, the more the silence seemed alive, the faintest echoes rising from shadowed corners. At first, they were distant murmurs, but soon they sharpened into whispers of cries for help, like voices trapped behind invisible walls. Suddenly, Ethan's light flickered, and in that instant, a chilling sensation gripped him, the unmistakable feeling that he was no longer alone. His heart hammered as he caught a glimpse of a pale figure disappearing into an adjacent room. He followed, adrenaline mixing with dread, entering a long ward once filled with the hopeless and the lost. The air grew thicker, suffused with cold sorrow, as if the very walls had absorbed decades of suffering. He found an old wheelchair overturned, its metal frame stained and cracked. As he knelt to examine it, a faint tapping sound echoed, a slow, rhythmic knocking from down the hall. Each tap seemed to reverberate through the dead silence, a haunting code from beyond. Drawn forward, Ethan passed cell after cell, noticing faded handprints smeared across walls, desperate scratches etched deep into timber. In one room, the faint, ghostly outline of a woman appeared briefly in his flashlight's glow, is hollow, mouth opening in a silent scream, before vanishing again. Panic threatened to consume him, but fascination held him locked in place. At the ward's end, a heavy door hung ajar, leading to the old treatment rooms. As he pushed it open, the whispers crescendoed into agonized wails that shook the air, a cacophony of lost souls pleading for release. Ethan backed away, but a sudden, cold gust slammed the door shut behind him. Trapped, he dropped his flashlight, plunging the room into pitch darkness. In the inky black spectral hands seemed to brush against his skin, cold, clammy, insistent. The wails turned into a single voice, a barely audible whisper cutting through the chaos. "Help me." It was a desperate plea, soaked in pain and longing, that burrowed into his soul. Ethan's breathing quickened, a crushing weight of sorrow closing in, until a terrible realization settled. These echoes were not just memories, they were cries from minds twisted by torment. Caught between worlds, endlessly trapped in the asylum's sinister grip. With a struggle born of fear and instinct, Ethan forced the door open and fled into the night, the anguished voices chasing him into the cold air outside. His escape was frantic, heart pounding in his ears as he crossed the rusted gate, safe, but forever haunted in the days after. Ethan's footage revealed strange anomalies, fleeting shadows, faces glimpsed in reflections, and a final frame showing a gaunt figure standing silently behind him, eyes burning with sorrow. He never returned to the asylum, but the nights that followed were filled with whispered voices through the darkness, and a chilling certainty that the echoes of the lost would follow him forever, watching, waiting, trapped between this world and the next. Story 4. The Whispering Forest. For as long as the locals could remember, the twisted woods, just beyond the sleepy town of Raven's Hollow, had been a place whispered about in hushed tones. A forest where the trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. Even in daylight, the forest cast long shadows that lingered like dark stains on the earth. But it was after midnight, when the moon was just a sliver, that the woods came alive in ways no one dared to explain. It began the night David, a seasoned outdoorsman and skeptic of local legends, decided to test the stories for himself. Drawn by curiosity and a stubborn disbelief in anything supernatural, he set out just as the dusk bled away, carrying only a flashlight and his backpack. The air was crisp, heavy with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves. As he stepped beneath the dense canopy, an unnatural silence fell around him. The usual chirping of crickets and rustling of small animals vanished completely, swallowed by an oppressive stillness. Hours passed as David ventured deeper, the trail narrowing and twisting, swallowed by towering trees that blocked out much of the weak moonlight. That's when he first heard it, a faint whisper, soft and fragmented, like voices carried by the cold wind. At first, he convinced himself it was just the rustle of leaves or the creaking of branches, nothing more than nature's sounds playing tricks. But the whispers grew clearer, twisting into shapes that barely formed words, a fragile prayer or warning slipping through the darkness. Unease blossomed in his chest. He paused, listening intently. The forest around him was no longer natural. It felt like a creature, breathing silently, watching. The air chilled, wrapping around his skin in a biting frost that had no place in summer. His flashlight flickered weakly, then steadied. But the beam cut through a mist that seemed to seep from the ground itself, curling at his feet like living smoke. Suddenly something brushed past him, a whisper that was no longer distant, but right next to his ear. "Leave," it breathed, soft and urgent, a breath on his neck that made his skin crawl. David spun around, heart hammering, but found only twisting shadows and gnarled trunks. The whisper came again, closer this time. "You shouldn't be here." Panic seeped into his limbs as the forest seemed to close in on him. He tried to backtrack, but the path seemed to dissolve, the trees rearranging as if alive, blocking his escape. Every step forward revealed new horrors, a twisted silhouette disappearing behind a tree, eyes gleaming faintly in the gloom, a fleeting glimpse of a pale hand vanishing beneath a fallen log. The whispers became a chorus, overlapping voices rising into a chilling crescendo of pleadings and threats. "Stay with us forever. Never leave." The air grew thick with sorrow and menace, suffocating and heavy, pressing down on David's mind until reality itself seemed to warp. Hours slipped away, or maybe just minutes, for time became meaningless in the forest's grasp. David's flashlight died, plunging him into impenetrable darkness. In the black tendrils of shadow curled around him, cold and probing, a final voice, sorrowful and terrible, echoed through the void. "You came looking for truth. Now become part of it." The next morning, when a search party found his backpack abandoned at the edge of the forest, two things were certain. David was gone, swallowed whole by the whispering woods. The deeper they ventured, the thicker the silence became, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Though they called for him, marking the trees with glowing ribbons, no answer returned. Tonight, if you wander close enough to Ravens Hollow after midnight, you might hear the faintest whispers drifting on the breeze, urgent, longing trapped voices begging for release, or perhaps warning the next unwary soul to never enter the whispering forest. Story 5. The Cursed Train That Crosses at Midnight in the quiet town of Hollow Creek. Nestled between dense forests and forgotten mountains, an old railroad line cuts through like a scar across the landscape. For decades, locals have told hushed stories about the Midnight Express, a spectral train said to appear only after midnight, traveling on rails no longer maintained and long abandoned by the living. The legend was first whispered by an elderly man named Harold, who had been the last conductor on that line before it was shut down in the early 1950s. He told tales of a cursed night when an accident shut down the tracks forever, a collision that tore apart a passenger car full of families heading home from a holiday gathering. The tragedy left dozens dead, their bodies never fully recovered, lost in the twisted wreckage and shadowed forests. Yet, the train never truly stopped running. For years after the accident, townsfolk reported seeing ghostly lights flicker far off in the distance, accompanied by the distant sound of a whistle that pierced the night air like a mournful cry. Some claimed the train itself was trapped in a loop endlessly rolling through the darkness, bound by the souls of those who died, doomed to relive their final journey over and over. Evelyn, a curious young reporter with a skeptical mind, arrived in Hollow Creek, determined to uncover the truth behind the tales. She spent days interviewing locals, gathering stories of the train's appearances, eerie fogs settling on the tracks, and strange sensations experienced by those brave enough to venture near the old railway at night. On the 7th night, Evelyn decided to witness the legend firsthand. Armed with a flashlight and her recorder, she positioned herself near the dilapidated crossing sign just as midnight approached. The forest around her was unnervingly silent, as though holding its breath. At precisely 12:03 a.m., a deep rumble rolled through the valley, not the mechanical groan of a modern train, but a low, otherworldly roar that grew steadily louder. Lights flickered on the horizon, gradually resolving into the unmistakable shape of the Midnight Express, a rusted, ancient locomotive with flickering lanterns, its cars trailing phantom silhouettes, swaying like ghosts trapped within. Evelyn's skin prickled as the spectral train thundered past, the air charged with cold electricity. The windows glowed with an unnatural light, and through them, faces appeared, pale, hollow-eyed passengers staring out in silent misery. The sound was deafening, a symphony of screeching wheels, mournful horn blasts, and anguished whispers that seeped into her mind, frozen in place. Evelyn felt a sudden gust sweep through, carrying faint voices calling names, her own name included in desperate, pleading tones. Fear gripped her heart as the train disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind the acrid scent of smoke and a heavy silence that pressed down like a shroud. The next morning, Evelyn was found unconscious near the tracks, her recorder cracked, but still intact. When she played it back, the tape contained hours of static, disturbed only by fragmented whispers and chilling screams that crescendoed into a blood-curdling shriek before cutting off. Evelyn never recovered fully. She left Hollow Creek shortly after, haunted by nightmares filled with flickering lanterns, spectral passengers, and the endless cursed journey of the Midnight Express. Even now, travelers passing through the old railway crossing sometimes feel a sudden drop in temperature after midnight, hear distant whistles echoing through the trees, and catch glimpses of a ghostly train that rides the rails forever, carrying its mournful cargo through the dark, a relentless reminder that some tragedies never rest. Story 6. The Silent Caller. It started with the phone calls. At first, just a single ring in the dead of night, the kind that flicks the skin with sudden electricity, making you jump before the chilling silence sets in. Hannah was a young woman, living alone in a modest apartment deep within a city that never truly sleeps. She wasn't superstitious, but when those calls began arriving exactly at midnight, night after night, unease began to coil tight in her chest. The number was always blocked. When she answered, there was nothing but static and the faintest, almost imperceptible breathing, cold and ragged, like the sound of someone gasping for air after a desperate struggle. Sometimes there was a whisper so low she doubted her own ears, a soft word, help, or a sigh, heavy with sorrow and warning, trying to shrug it off as a prank or technical glitch. Hannah ignored the calls, but the calls only grew more frequent and unsettling. On the 4th night, she noticed something new, a single breath, followed by a faint, repetitive tapping, like nails rapping on wood, each tap drawn out and deliberate. The sound felt purposeful, like a desperate message from a trapped soul. Unable to bear the torment, Hannah checked with her phone provider. The number was untraceable. She reached out to the police, but they suggested it was probably a hoax or a glitch, nothing they could act on unless the calls escalated. But escalation came quickly. One night, Hannah's phone rang endlessly. With trembling hands, she answered, and suddenly the line was pierced by ragged screams, cut off abruptly, as though someone had been silenced mid-cry. The horrifying sound echoed in her mind long after she hung up, a brutal intrusion invading the safety of her own home. Paranoia set in. Hannah would sit in every room, waiting for the phone to ring at midnight, anxiety gnawing at her sanity. Then came the threatening notes slipped under her door, anonymous messages scrawled in trembling, erratic handwriting, begging her for help, warning her to leave, and cryptic references to names she didn't recognize. One night, compelled by fear and curiosity, Hannah traced the call through a friend's tech-savvy network. The line led to an abandoned house on the edge of town, a place whispered about as the former residence of a woman who vanished without a trace years before. Neighbors recalled strange noises, whispers, footsteps, faint cries from the boarded-up windows late into the night. Determined to break the terror, Hannah visited the house under a sickly moon. The air was thick and stale, reeking of mildew and lost memories. Inside, the floorboards groaned, and shadows twisted unnaturally in her flashlight's beam. The silence was heavy, oppressive, broken only by faint tapping from somewhere deep within the walls. Suddenly, her phone rang. The screen was blank. She answered only static. Then, clear as day, a voice whispered, "Thank you." A sense of unbearable sadness washed over her, chilling to the bone. Before the line went dead, Hannah fled, her mind reeling with terror and sympathy. The calls ceased, leaving only the haunted knowledge she had touched something beyond comprehension, tortured soul trapped in between worlds, calling out in the silent hours for rescue or release. Even now, long after the calls stopped, Hannah remembers the cold breath, the desperate tapping, and the sorrowful whisper that will forever echo in the midnight silence. Story 7. The Night Stalker. In the woods in a remote region, where the forest thickens into an endless sea of darkness, a chilling legend has lived for generations of a ghostly figure stalking the woods after midnight, searching for lost travelers. Jamie, an amateur hiker, had ignored all warnings, eager to prove the stories were just superstition. But one late summer night, as twilight slipped into darkness, Jamie found himself swallowed by the trees, with only a flashlight and a fading sense of direction. As the clock edged past midnight, the forest around him grew unnaturally silent. The familiar night sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, ceased. A cold wind whispered through the branches, carrying faint, fractured voices that seemed to seep from shadows rather than leaves. Unease prickled Jamie's skin when a faint orange glow appeared far ahead, flickering like a campfire as dying embers drawn in by hope. Jamie approached cautiously, only to see a lone figure standing next to the fire. Relief flooded him, and the figure shifted abruptly and disappeared into the darkness. His heart pounding, Jamie called out but was met with silence. Then the creeping realization that the figure was no ordinary person, but something else entirely. Panic set in as Jamie tried to retrace his steps, but the forest twisted unnaturally around him. Whispers turned to harsh commands, shadows morphed into threatening shapes, and distant footsteps echoed behind him, growing ever closer. Jamie's flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into utter blackness. In the void, icy fingers brushed his skin, and a voice hissed, "You shouldn't have come here." Hours later, when search parties entered the forest, they found only Jamie's dropped backpack near the edge, the campfire cold and extinguished. To this day, hikers report whispers in the night, flickers of orange light deep in the woods, and a shadowy figure watching silently from the darkness. Jamie was never seen, again, his fate absorbed into the ever-hungry forest, a grim warning to those who wander after midnight. Story 8. The Midnight Phone Call. At exactly midnight, the phone rang always, the same time, every night without fail. Emily had never believed in ghosts or curses, nor did she think much of strange coincidences. But when she moved into her new apartment in a city that never quite slept, the quiet night assumed an entirely different meaning. It began as a single call from an unknown number, the screen blacked out, the caller ID unreadable. There was no greeting when she answered only a distorted voice, fractured and barely audible, whispering to words that echoed in her bones, "Watch the door." Emily shivered, instincts screaming, but she couldn't hang up. The voice repeated, a slow, chilling refrain that twisted her insides. Every night after that, precisely at midnight, the phone would ring. No caller name, no message, just the same cold warning. Watch the door. At first, she told herself it was a prank, a cruel joke from someone playing games. She recorded one of the calls, hoping to convince herself or friends it was just static noise. But the recording captured more a low creak, like the sound of a door slowly opening in the background, followed by the voice adding in a whisper, "Now you see." Her heart pounded through the sleepless nights as she started obsessively checking locks on windows and doors. Startled by the slightest noises from floorboards, settling to the faint scraping of branches against the building's exterior. Each night, the air grew colder, heavier, as if some unseen presence lurked just beyond the walls. One night, overwhelmed by terror and exhaustion, Emily set up a camera focused on her apartment door. As the clock crept to midnight, the phone rang. She heard the voice, the warning clear and icy. "Watch the door." Then, in the video footage she reviewed the next morning, the door, the very door she had locked and bolted, was seen slowly creaking open on its own, revealing an empty, shadowed hallway beyond. The proof shattered her disbelief. She fled her apartment that very night, never to return. Friends later told her about the previous tenant, who vanished, seen entering the building, but never leaving. Local rumors spoke of a restless spirit trapped in the apartment, bound to repeat its final warning to whoever lived there next. Even now, years and countless moves later, Emily's phone sometimes rings at midnight. No caller ID, no one on the line, but cold static that carries a faint whisper, "Watch the door." Some warnings aren't just words. They are a presence, a memory, a chilling promise that what haunts the night is closer than you think, and it never forgets to knock. Story 9. The Vanishing Mansion. In the quiet outskirts of a small town stood a grand old mansion, known to locals simply as the Vanishing Mansion. It was once a magnificent home, an architectural marvel with tall pillars, intricate ironwork, and sprawling gardens. But time and tragedy had shrouded it in mystery and dread. Stories whispered of people who entered the mansion only to disappear without a trace, leaving the world wondering if the house itself had swallowed them whole. The mansion had been empty for decades, its windows boarded up, the faded paint peeling like dead skin. Neighbors spoke of strange phenomena, flickering lights late at night when no one lived inside, ghostly silhouettes glimpsed in upper windows, and an eerie silence that seemed to absorb even the wind. Some dared not approach after dark, claiming that the air around the mansion felt thick and unnatural, as though the house bent reality itself. It was a warm summer evening when Sarah, a curious college student intrigued by paranormal lore, decided to explore the mansion. She had heard the local legends but was determined to uncover the truth. As she crossed the threshold beneath the rusted iron gate, a sudden shiver ran through her. The heavy wooden door creaked open with surprising ease, revealing shadows that seemed unnervingly alive. Inside, the house was a cavern of darkness, and decayed dust hung thick in the air, swirling in faint beams of moonlight filtering through broken shutters. The floorboards groaned underfoot, and the air smelled of damp wood and forgotten memories. Sarah moved cautiously through ornate hallways lined with old portraits, whose eyes seemed to follow her every step. Hours passed as she explored, her flashlight cutting swaths through the darkness. But with each step, the mansion itself seemed to shift and change, corridors stretching longer than before, doorways appearing where none had been moments prior. Whispers danced just beyond hearing, indistinct but filled with sorrow and warning. Shadows moved at the edges of her vision, darting away when caught in the light. Then, the unthinkable happened. Sarah realized she was lost. Doors that once led to familiar rooms now opened onto endless darkness, or twisted staircases that descended into voids. Panic clawed at her chest as she retraced her steps, only to find the halls rearranging like a maze with a will of its own. Her phone died inexplicably, and the silence deepened into a heavy, suffocating presence that pressed in on all sides. Suddenly, in the grand parlor, she spotted something impossible, the faint outline of a figure, someone else, trapped in the labyrinth. The figure reached out, mouth open in a silent scream as it faded away. Then came the chilling realization that the mansion held many like her, lost souls caught in its shifting grip. Sarah's heart pounded as she raced towards what she hoped was an exit, but the mansion's walls closed in, swallowing sound and light. Time fractured. Hours bled into minutes, and minutes into an eternity of fear. Just as exhaustion threatened to claim her, a door she hadn't seen before swung open. Spilling sunlight into the darkness, she stepped through, breathless and trembling, and found herself back at the rusted iron gate, the mansion looming silent and still behind her. But the world outside had shifted. Her belongings were no longer where she had left them, and days had passed unnoticed. Sarah never spoke about what happened inside the vanishing mansion, and as tales of others who entered and never returned grew, the mansion became a local legend of the lost and forgotten. Some say the house exists both in this world and another, a shifting doorway that devours the unwary, trapping them forever in its endless maze. And sometimes, late at night, those who live nearby swear they see ghostly figures trapped behind the mansion's broken windows, still searching, still lost, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to enter and never come back. Story 10. The Last Message from the Forgotten Room. In an old town where every building seemed to hold secrets, beneath its worn bricks, there was a mysterious, rarely visited hotel known only to locals as the Wraiths, and the hotel had been shuttered for years after a series of unexplained disappearances, who checked in but never checked out, vanishing without a trace, their rooms left untouched, and their belongings exactly where they had been left. The final chapter of the inn's dark history centered around room 227, a room that held a chilling legacy. James, an investigative journalist, hungry for answers, and skeptical of ghost stories, arrived one rainy evening with a mission to uncover the truth behind the inn's rumors. His plan was to spend the night in room 27, a place whispered about in hushed tones as cursed, haunted, and deadly. The moment he stepped inside, a suffocating stillness wrapped around him. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp wood and forgotten despair. Despite the eerie silence, James settled in, noting the peeling wallpaper, aged furniture, and a peculiar, cracked mirror hanging opposite the bed. Hours passed in oppressive quiet until just before midnight, when faint sounds began, soft knocks on the old wooden door, footsteps pacing outside the room, and whispers that slipped through the cracks beneath the walls. The voices were unintelligible at first, but gradually, they formed words, a low chant repeating over and over, "Don't leave. Don't look back." Shaken but determined, James recorded the eerie sounds on his phone, trying to catch every detail. Suddenly, the mirror seemed to ripple, as if it were alive. Reflections distorted, showing fleeting images of faces contorted in terror and sorrow, former guests, trapped in endless torment. The temperature dropped sharply, and a spectral figure appeared in the glass, a pale woman with hollow eyes, silently mouthing a desperate plea, "Help me." Panic surged as the chants grew louder and the walls seemed to pulse with an unseen energy. James tried to open the door, but it was stuck tight, as if the room itself was imprisoning him. Hours dragged on with no escape, the presence growing more oppressive, feeding off his rising fear. At the stroke of 3:33 a.m., time twisted. His phone lit up with a single message from an unknown number, "You are next." Desperate, James smashed the mirror and yanked the door open. He fled down the empty corridors, the whispering voices chasing him. When he finally burst into the cold night air, he gasped for breath, realizing something horrible. His phone had no signal, and his recording was gone, replaced by static and a final, chilling whisper. "Welcome to the forgotten, James." Left the Wraiths in behind, but the message lingered like a curse. Weeks later, friends noticed he stopped answering his phone. And then one final text came through. "They're coming for you at midnight." After that silence, the room was never rented again. Some say the inn waits still, hungry for those who dare stay past midnight, trapping them in its forgotten shadows. Destined to join the long list of vanished souls, doomed to haunt its walls for eternity.